Hey guys, I'm Adrienne Dunworth, and today I will be talking about a study titled Anatomically Distinct Dopamine Release During Anticipation and Experience of Peak Emotion to Music by Salenpour and others, and this was published in 2011 in Nature Neuroscience. So basically, this study is looking at how the brain responds to music, and more specifically, how dopamine is involved in that process. So basically, this study is looking at how the brain responds to music, and more specifically, how dopamine is involved in that process. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter and a hormone, often called the feel-good chemical, and plays a major role in the brain's reward system, motivation, pleasure, attention, and also helping regulate body movement. So there has been a lot of research done in observing dopamine effects in situations where the brain is either directly stimulated from biological factors that are necessary for survival, such as, for example, when the body consumes food, synthetic chemicals like psychoactive drugs such as things like caffeine, cocaine, alcohol, etc., or through tangible items that are secondary rewards, such as when a person suddenly is in possession of money, for example. However, though, music is kind of different. It's not something we need to survive, nor is it a psychoactive drug or a tangible item, but it still has a really strong effect on us. So when we listen to music, especially music that we really enjoy, dopamine is released, which triggers the brain's reward system. So this happens in the striatum part of the brain, the part of the brain involved in decision-making functions such as motor control, habit formation, and most importantly, in the case of music, emotions and reward. So, have you ever experienced chills when listening to a really cool song? Personally, that happens to me anytime I listen to any of my favorite songs. I get chills everywhere, and that's how I know that I really love the song and it really hit me emotionally in a deep way. So, according to Salenpour, evidence actually suggests that the rewarding qualities of music are not directly tied to chemical and biological influences, such as the rewarding feeling we are all getting. Like, we get the reward feeling from eating food, but instead by listener, because each of us has different music preferences. One person may get an emotional high listening to country music, while someone else may hate the song because they dislike country music. So, that raises the question of why something like music, which isn't necessary to our survival, isn't a drug-induced stimulus, nor a tangible item, such as money and nice clothing, can feel so rewarding. And that's really what the study is trying to figure out, and what's actually happening in the brain during those moments. What was the issue and why was it important? So to understand why this study matters, it helps to think about how music affects people in general. So music is something most people interact with every day, including myself, and it can have a really strong impact on our emotions. It can change our mood, bring back memories, or just honestly a really specific moment that felt extremely intense. Because of that, researchers have connected music to the brain's reward system, which involves dopamine. But even though we know music can activate that system, there's still something that wasn't fully understood. And the main issue is how dopamine responds over time while you're listening to music. Because when you listen to a song specifically, it's not just that one moment, as you typically listen to the entire song. There's usually a build-up, like when you know there's a big part coming up in a bridge or a chorus, and then there's the actual moment when it hits. And those two parts can feel really different. So now the question that needs to be asked is, does the brain treat the anticipation phase and the actual emotional peak phase the same way, or are they different? So from that, the researchers came up with a few main questions. The biggest one is how dopamine behaves during music listening. Does it remain elevated for the entire song and at the same level, or does the change in dopamine release vary depending on what part of the song you're listening to? And more specifically, they wanted to understand if dopamine acts differently when you're anticipating a moment, like when you know your favorite part is coming up in a song, compared to when that moment actually happens. They also wanted to know if different parts of the brain are involved in these two phases. Because if they are, that would suggest that anticipation and the emotional peak are actually separate processes. And that's interesting because anticipation itself can feel very rewarding. Like sometimes the build-up in a song is just as exciting as the main part. And researchers can use music to measure dopamine release by the brain's response over time, and it's not just at one specific point. Essentially, before the song is heard, during the song, paying attention to where the peaks occur, and then after the song is finished. So, what tools were used to explore the question? So, to study this, the researchers used something both MRIs and PET scans, which lets them look at dopamine activity in the brain. Basically, it uses a tracer that helps show how dopamine is interacting with different areas. When dopamine is released, it changes how that tracer binds, so researchers can track those changes. And during the experiment, participants were listening to the music while they were inside the scanner. So the researchers could actually see what was happening in the brain as the music was playing. The goal was to track how dopamine changed during different parts of the song, especially leading up to emotional moments and during them. What's important about this method is that it doesn't just rely on people saying how they feel. It gives actual evidence of what's happening in the brain at the same time. So it connects the emotional experience to the real biological activity. So, looking at the results, the researchers found that dopamine is released during both anticipation and the actual emotional peak, but in different ways. During anticipation, so before the big moment, dopamine activity showed up in an area is called the caudate nucleus. This part of the brain is linked to things like expectation and prediction. Then, during the peak emotional moment, dopamine activity shifted to another area called the nucleus accumbens, which is more connected to pleasure and reward. So, even though dopamine is involved in both phases, the brain is using different regions for each one. That suggests that anticipation and the actual experience are being processed separately. They also found that stronger emotional reactions were linked to stronger dopamine activity. So what people were feeling matched what was happening in their brain. Figure 3 in Salempour's study actually shows the functional magnetic resonance imaging and position emission tomography results, basically MRIs and PET scans, to compare dopamine release levels in the caudate and the nucleus accumbens part of the brain. As summarized earlier, the results shown in Figure 3 suggest that the dopamine activity was maximum in the caudate region of the brain during the anticipatory phase of the song, essentially peaking just before the awaited section of that current song, such as the chorus. However, once the anticipated part of the song was reached, the dopamine release in the caudate began to decrease, with a simultaneous increased release of dopamine that was seen in the nucleus accumbens part of the brain when the listener actually heard the part of the song she was waiting to hear. The dopamine release level in the nucleus accumbens during the experience, which is the part of the song that was anticipated, actually far exceeded the level of dopamine released in the caduate during the anticipatory phase. Salimport also demonstrated in Figure 1. Further, Salimport and Figure 4 measured brain and behavior relationships involving temporal components of pleasure. The number of chills reported was correlated to bold response during the anticipatory phase. So, a greater number of chills results in a greater anticipation, essentially. This greater chill activity was associated more with dopamine activity in areas of the brain associated with anticipation, such as the caduate. This suggests that the caduate is involved in the experience of the music listening pleasure. What do these findings imply? So based on those results, this study actually suggests that anticipation and peak emotion are two different parts of the same experience. Both are important, but they play different roles. Anticipation builds up the feeling, and the peak moment is where that feeling kind of pays off, essentially. So, this helps explain why the build-up in music can feel just as important as the main moment. It also shows that dopamine isn't only about the reward itself, but also about the process leading up to it. Another interesting point is that music can activate the brain's reward system even though it's not necessary for survival. So even though this study gives a lot of insight, there are some limits to keep in mind. First, the participants. The study focused on people who already have strong reactions to music. So basically, the results might not apply to everyone. If you don't feel strong emotions from music, your brain response might look different because it looks different for everybody. Another point is the music choice. Participants picked their own songs, and this helped create real emotion. At the same time, those songs in particular may connect to memories or personal meaning that could influence the results, basically. So, the study was also designed to let enrollees do self-reporting, which could have influenced the results. And participants had to stay when they felt strong emotion, essentially. So people experience emotion in different ways, and some people might report more or less than others. It really just depends. The PET scan and MRI technology also has limits. It measures dopamine as an indirect way, so it does not give a perfect picture of what is actually happening in the brain. And looking ahead, future research should include a wider range of participants. And I feel like this would help show if the same pattern appears across different people, essentially. Researchers should also test different types of music. I think this would show the results and how they would stay consistent across all genres, and it would just really give us a bigger picture. It would also help to study how background, culture, or music training affects these responses. So, this study gives us a strong base, And there is still more to learn about how music and the brain connect.